Good morning, tiny people. Here we go again. We have a lovely little quiz. Time to get on with some more notes. 11 states eventually left the Union to form the Confederate States of America, also known as the CSA. So you'll see me refer to in notes as CSA or USA. Those are the two sides. The North, the American government, is the USA. The South is the Confederate States of America, the CSA. Their idea was to make a government similar to the United States, but with strong limits on the power of the central government. This was really important to them that the states should maintain their rights, having more authority than the national government did. It did not take the southern states long to form their constitution. Matter of fact, it was only a couple of weeks because they simply took the United States Constitution, said that the states would be more powerful, and then embedded slavery permanently into their country's allure. It started with South Carolina, and that's the only order that I care you remember is that South Carolina was first, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. I do want you to remember the 11 Confederate states. It's very important. Even when you get to Mr. Goddard next year, you will hear what's called the Solid South. That bloc voted Democratic well into the 20th century. So keep in mind the former Confederate states are what people refer to when they talk about the South, capital S. Those are the states in gray on this map. There were also some states that were bordered on one side by northern states, by the other side on southern states. Well, these were Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Let's take them one at a time. Remember that the District of Columbia, where the United States capital of Washington is located on a 10 square mile piece of land between Virginia and Maryland. Virginia had already seceded. They had gone south. They were now a part of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln understood that if Maryland was allowed to secede, then he would have a real problem because the capital of the United States would arguably be in a different country. Therefore, Abraham Lincoln took the 75,000 volunteers that he had called for 3 months and put most of them inside the state of Maryland. That kept Maryland from seceding. Understand also a basic definition of these border states. These were states that did have slavery but did not secede. The second one was Missouri. Missouri over there had St. Louis, the gateway to the West. Railroads had been built through it. That's where the Santa Fe and the Oregon trails really took off from. Abraham Lincoln could not stand to lose that connection with the West. And so he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, written up there at the top. Remember when we studied the Constitution, habeas corpus is a legal term which means a person has to be told what crime they are charged with. Well, Abraham Lincoln noted that one of the rules in the Constitution is that the writ of habeas corpus, the requirement for someone to be told what they're being charged with, is suspended in times of revolution or can be suspended in times of rebellion. Therefore, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and had a number of politicians in Missouri arrested and put into jail without ever charging them with a crime, and some of them spent the entire war in prison. The state of Kentucky, this was almost 50-50. Half of the population wanted to stay with the North, remain Americans, get rid of slavery. The other half, really almost 50%, wanted to keep their slaves and break off into being a Confederate state. Well, at first, Kentucky was so divided, they declared themselves to be neutral. Neutral means we're not going to take either side. We're going to sit this one out. But Kentucky controlled the Ohio River, navigation along there. It was so important to both sides that eventually, although each side had originally respected Kentucky's neutrality, Eventually, when the South had been pushed back a little bit, Abraham Lincoln said, don't worry about it, just go in there. And so armies went into Kentucky. And West Virginia is very unique. The state of Virginia used to include also what is now West Virginia. When the Civil War began, both of those states were contained in the state of Virginia. And Virginia decided that they would secede. They would leave the United States and go with the Confederacy. Well, the mountains run down the area right between Virginia and West Virginia. And on the western side, slavery is not nearly as profitable. They don't have the same kind of conditions for growing cotton or tobacco and such. And so West Virginia said, look, if Virginia can secede from the United States, then West Virginia certainly can secede from Virginia. And they did. And Abraham Lincoln did recognize that as a legitimate government, the people that had taken over that part of the state. Well, how did the two sides compare? As far as central governments were concerned, the United States had strong central powers. Lincoln had a lot of power to yield. He was in charge of the government that was fighting the war. On the other side, the Confederates, remember, had kept most of the power within their individual state governments. And the president of the Confederacy, here comes an important name, Jefferson Davis. The president of the Confederacy was a senator, a former U.S. senator from Mississippi. His name was Jefferson, capital Jeffferson, capital Jeffferson, Davis, capital Davis. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy, and he did not have enough power to wage this war. As far as economies were concerned, the United States had industrialized. It had grown powerful in the manufacturing of goods, whereas the Confederate States were still vastly agricultural and mostly producing cotton. To break it down more specifically, let's look at railroad mileage. Each side was now able to move armies, products, goods, weapons, all of the accoutrements of war via railroads. If you take a look down on the right-hand side of this picture, you'll notice standing right next to the railroad track is a very good-looking history teacher from Brookfield Academy. Going to your left, we're starting and using the railroad track as a bar graph. If you look at all of the railroad mileage in the United States, go from where I'm standing up until that first orange cone, you will see that that's about 28%. That's 28 railroad ties up to that point. If you start from me again and go all the way over to the far cone, that's 72 railroad ties. Now, the South only had the 28. 28% of all the railroad mileage that had been put down, all the railroad tracks, was in the South. 72% of all the railroad tracks in the United States were in the North. Bank deposits played a huge part. These two lines, there are $100 bills there. The side on the left, that's what the Confederacy had in banks in the South. Only 19% of all of the bank deposits, all of the money held in institutions, was held in the South. The other 81%, the line on the right, was held in the North. Now remember what can be done with bank deposits. Banks need to turn a profit, which means they need to lend out the deposits they have. Therefore, when someone who, say, has a factory wants to change from making thimbles into making bullets, they're going to need some new equipment, and they're going to have to borrow the money to do that. If somebody wants to go from making butter knives to swords, the same thing is true. They'll have to change some of the equipment or add on to the equipment in their factory. All of the money to do those things was available up in the North, not so in the South. And of course, governments can borrow some of the money in banks also. I decided the easiest way to show you the white population would be to look at a lot of bald men standing together. Matter of fact, there are 100 bald guys here. All the guys on the left were going to be fighting for the United States. Percentage wise, 71% of all the white people in the country were living in the North. Over on the right, that's 29%, 29 people over there. Why this is important is when the war began, the only people who were called on to fight were white men. Yes, they did have the vote, but they also had the responsibility to fight. As the war progressed, the white population in the North would be supplemented by African Americans. The black people in the country who knew that some of their relatives were still in slavery, or their friends, or just people that were like them, wanted to help fight for the cause and free the slaves. And so there were more African Americans who joined in to help with the fight. If you look over on the right to the Southern population, just 29%, and remember, they couldn't use all of those people. It already looks like an extreme disadvantage, but they already had a couple of million slaves down south, and those slaves, to stay in slavery, had to be guarded. So all of the men of military age with fighting ability could not go to the front with the armies. Some of them had to stay back and make sure that the slaves remained slaves. Up north, on the left, they had bustling factories. They were producing all kinds of goods for the war effort. They had 85% of all of the factories in the country. 85%. Over in the south, they had only 15% of the factories. They made very few things like guns and cannon. What they had to do was get those from foreign allies, maybe move them up through Mexico or on blockade running quick ships. What they did have was cotton. But of course, the North put a blockade around the southern coast and wouldn't let the cotton ships go out to sell their wares to Europe. So lots of the cotton just rotted on the wharfs. Also, the Southerners did a very boneheaded move at the beginning of the war. They decided that they would not get their cotton out quickly before the Northern blockade was in place. Instead, they thought, if we don't bring the cotton out, then Great Britain and France and those other countries of Europe that want our cotton will certainly enter the war on our side so that they can keep their manufacturing going. None of them did. In total, the cost of the war was $6,190,000,000 for the United States and $3 billion for the Confederacy. There's no real way to say, well, this is what that translates into today, because the needs and wants of people are so different in a different age. This is roughly buying power. About $15.87 today will buy you what $1 bought in 1865. So a rough translation of the cost of the war was $98,235,300,000 in today's dollars for the North, and $47,610,000,000 of today's dollars to fight for the South. The deaths in service. Now, these are the official numbers. The United States did keep track all the way through, because the United States government continued to function even after the war. Within 10 years, though, disease and injury raised these numbers to more than 1.5 million people between the two armies. And the Confederate numbers are less precise because towards the end, in the last couple of months of the war, there was no Confederate government. It had collapsed. The individuals who had had power had run away and were in hiding, and there was no one for the army to report to. What happens every day is that at every level of the army, from a squad to a company to a battalion to a regiment to an army, they report on up so that each commander knows what kind of shape his force is in. And at the end, no one really knew. But think about that. Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers to fight for 3 months. And within the space of those 4 years, about 625,000 men had died, and that became more than double within 10 years because of the disease and injury. And I'm going to leave you with that happy thought today, and we'll pick up the rest of understanding the Civil War tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you the best of times. Good night.